Well, as we keep saying throughout the evening, the life and the story of Winnie Madikizela-Mandela is a complex one, a rich tapestry. And the controversial Methodist Bishop Paul Verryn featured strongly in that story in the late 80s. Firstly, as a vocal critic of the Mandela United Football Club, and later when she became implicated in the disappearance of youths he had been housing and hiding from apartheid police. He now joins us for this interview in studio. Good evening, Bishop, and thank you for doing this. I mean, your histories and stories were certainly at a point intertwined, and yet, of course, you only ever met Winnie Mandela twice, you say?
Yes.
Tell me about those encounters.
The one was in front of the TRC. The other time was at a COSATU conference, and I was going into the hall and she was coming out, and we met one another briefly there.
And as I understand it, you had a brief moment, shall we call it reconciliation? There was a hug,
yes.
Certainly pleasantries exchanged?
Yes, it was very brief. Strange, you know, that our lives were so profoundly connected, and yet we didn't really know one another.
So let's go back to the beginning. I said in my introduction that you'd already been a vocal critic of the Mandela United Football Club. Even before the Stumpy matter arose, what were your concerns at the time? What were people, particularly in Soweto, raising concerns about at that time?
The concern was that there was a perception that they were driving fear into many people in Soweto. It was unpredictable, and that fear kind of spilled into the streets of the city.
And it wasn't a normal football club in the sense, you know, of a sporting team that might compete, say, in a Premier League or some such. What was the Mandela United Football Club?
I think it was a place of solidarity for young people who were involved in a struggle. And, you know, at that time in our history, one of the crucial questions was the question around violence. Do we change the narrative of this country by a violent intervention, or have we got to seek another way? I think people who were suffering profoundly, and I heard some of the tragic stories of people who were being intimidated as leaders in detention, drove people to the edge of desperation.
Now, can you place your context in Soweto at the time, your involvement with activists who found refuge from the apartheid security police?
So I moved into Soweto on the 17th of December 1987. And at that time, actually even before that time, there must have been between 30 and 40,000 young people in the country on the run from the police. And so you had activists as young as Stompy, even younger, 10 right up into their early 20s, who either had had a taste of detention, and let me say that some of the things that were done to children in detention were profoundly disturbing. And so the Wits Council of Churches, in fact, under the auspices of the South African Council of Churches, opened up sanctuaries around the Gauteng area. So there were some young people kept at Wilgespreid, there were some young people kept at the Lutheran Center in Bosmont. I had some young people living with me, actually up to 50, 60 at a time, from all over the country, from KwaZulu-Natal, from Mpumalanga, from Northwest, and then from this area, of course.
And so that's how the 11-year-old activist Stompy Sipe enters the story, I suppose, because he was on the run for facing public violence charges from Paris, was it not?
That's right. And there was anxiety around his safety. There were rumors that he had become a police informant, and actually Ace Magashule and Matthew Chaskelson brought him to me at Central Methodist. I wasn't the minister at Central at that stage. You know, Khotso House was bombed, and I was working for the South African Council of Churches at that stage, and my office was at Central, and they brought him to me, and I took him to my home.
So how did the story then disintegrate from that, you being involved with these activists, you being part of the Council of Churches operations to house activists who were fleeing the security police? How did it all disintegrate to allegations and accusations that there was even sexual abuse, some of it directed against you?
Well, you must know, in a house of that size, more than 50 people living, I mean, people were living and sleeping even in the bathroom, in the passages, in all the bedrooms. I would literally come home in the evening and have to find a place on my bed. And what happened, and I knew a bit of Stompie's story, you know, that he was at one stage, in effect, put into a coffin with a corpse to try and force him to give information of what was happening in Tumahole. And I came home for a church meeting and walked into my kitchen, and Xoliswa Falati was busy interrogating him, and he was in a terrible state. It was recreating his torture and the rest of it, and I was actually very angry with her and stopped her immediately and said, I do not want this place to become a replica of a police cell or interrogation room. And she then went to Winnie with all sorts of allegations around Stompie, and to give, I think, the story credibility, added all the sexual stuff as well. And then the kidnapping took place towards the end of December 1988.
Did the truth about what happened to Stompie and all the allegations around that time, was that all sufficiently aired out at the TRC? Was it all resolved, from what you can say?
I'm not sure. You know, I know that the church conducted quite extensive investigation into myself. Whatever, you know, I think Desmond Tutu described it accurately in saying something went terribly wrong. I feel responsible for ultimately what happened to Stompie. I should have had the insight that we were living in a very dark part of our history. To imagine that the children of our country were being put on the line and being broken down by people of power was almost incomprehensible. And so I think both of us, part of the narrative of his death has continued with us since then.
I think also looking back, you know, from 2018, it's startling to think of children as young as that being not only activists, but I suppose leading some of the actions that were taking place, and yet, as you say, remaining so vulnerable to forces that perhaps were even greater than anything they were aware of. But still, in that context, there are many other leaders who openly issued all kinds of orders in the context of those times. Have people who put the blame for Stompie's death squarely at the feet of Winnie Madikizela-Mandela, have they been unfair?
That's a profoundly difficult question to answer. They could put it at my feet as well. As we come to this moment in Winnie's life, I don't think she ever, knowing the sensitivity that she had around human rights, around human dignity, I don't think that shadow has ever left her. And I do pray, and I pray for her every night. I pray that this transition into the new chapter of her life is going to open up a day not of recrimination, not of judgment, but for both of us, of forgiveness and closure.
And perhaps a moving on and finally closing that awful, awful chapter. Bishop Paul Verryn, thank you for talking to us. That is, of course, the controversial Methodist Bishop Paul Verryn, whose life did intersect with that of Mama Madikizela-Mandela in the late 80s. And perhaps this is the final closing of that